I shouldn't say this in front of Dean Slayback, but if you really want to learn constitutional law up close and personal, prison's a pretty good place to do it. If any of you are thinking about it, I can give you detailed instructions on how to get there. Oddly enough, prison was the only place I could continue to practice law, writing writs of habeas corpus for other inmates. And got a couple of them out, actually, on writs. But I didn't come to talk about practicing jailhouse law. I'm here to talk about the Bill of Rights, two of which, freedom of the press and the right to counsel, are today under grave threat from our government. I was taught in law school that the 10 amendments comprising the Bill of Rights were separate individual silos of rights protecting us from our government, from overreach, that they were standalone rights. But since, over the last 50 years since I was in law school, the Bill of Rights has been interpreted not just as 10 individual sets of rights, but as a cohesive structural unit, and that the Bill of Rights protects the relationships between those 10 amendments, particularly the first and the sixth, the right to counsel and freedom of the press. That relationship has, over the life of the country, has created a synergy, not just a combination of the two, but the combination of the two creates a force greater than the two added together. In other words, 1 + 1 doesn't just equal 2, it could equal 3 or 4 because of the synergistic effect of lawyers and journalists working together. I believe that that synergy is under attack now from our government, from this particular administration. And I think that it threatens to destroy one of the great pillars of our American democracy. And the proof of the synergy and the value of it can really be explained in 4 cases since before our country was founded. The first is a 1725 case of John Peter Zenger, who was a printer in New York who printed a pamphlet that was critical of the royal governor. And in those days, truth was not a defense. So Zenger was charged with sedition under English law. And he was defended by an enterprising lawyer named Andrew Hamilton. Not Alexander Hamilton, but Andrew Hamilton. And even though the judge instructed the jury that truth was not a defense, Hamilton convinced the jury that it should be. And they found in favor of John Peter Zenger and acquitted him. Now fast forward 200 years to the case of Neer versus Minnesota. J. Neer was a publisher of more of a rag and tabloid than anything else, a scandal sheet, if you will, in Minneapolis. And they had a sedition law there, or nuisance law in Minnesota, and the government of Minnesota used the nuisance law to shut him down, to shut the whole press down. And that was accepted practice in those days before his case got to the Supreme Court. So he lost his case at the lower courts, but he was defended by a man named Weymouth Kirkland. That's an aristocratic sounding name. I want you to remember that. Weymouth Kirkland. And he got the court to rule that there would be no prior restraints against the press. Neer versus Minnesota is a case that we all rely on today for the press not being forced to not print a story before it comes out. Again, a synergy between a publisher and a lawyer made that happen, gives us the right to print what we want today. The third case is the one many of you know, and it's still current today, is New York Times versus Sullivan. And that case involved an Alabama public official who was the target of a full-page ad in the New York Times that contained a few minor inaccuracies. So he sues the New York Times in Alabama court, gets a verdict against the Times for $500,000, which was a lot of money in those days. It could be particularly ruinous. It was a great example of what's called a slap suit, strategic litigation against public participation. That is, sue the newspaper, make it too expensive for them to print, and they'll go away. That's what a slap suit is designed to do, and that's what this was. Well, when it got to the Supreme Court, they reversed 9-0. And they set the rule, the actual malice rule that you know about. That is, if a public official or a public figure wants to file a libel suit against a newspaper or anyone else, he has to prove that the newspaper knew of the falsehood, knew it would hurt him, and published anyway or with reckless disregard of the truth. In other words, actual malice. And that pretty much for a while put a stop to the slap suits, because the Supreme Court in a 9-0 ruling had told the world that we're not going to put up libel lawsuits against newspapers. You better have pretty good reason, pretty good facts to do that. And I'm not sure there have been any cases where actual malice was found. Sullivan, or rather the New York Times, was defended by Herb Brownell, who had been Attorney General under Eisenhower, and William Rogers, who was later the Secretary of State under Nixon. And the synergy of those two figures working with the New York Times has established the actual malice rule, which still stands today, although there are a number of efforts going on now, including the lawsuit against Mississippi Today, trying to get the Supreme Court to loosen that standard up. So far, it's still good law. And then the final illustrative case is New York Times versus United States, or the Pentagon Papers case. Daniel Ellsberg was a highly placed Pentagon official who leaked to the New York Times secret studies that had been done on the Vietnam War. And they showed that this was before the war started, before we got into it, showing that it could not be won. And he wanted to make sure the world knew that the government had gone ahead and started this war in Vietnam with knowing it couldn't be won. And so the Nixon administration got wind of this, and they sued the New York Times, again for prior restraint, saying national security required an injunction to stop these secret documents from being published. The government, again, in that case, in the Pentagon Papers case, the lower courts found in favor of the government that national defense was a proper reason to stop publication. But when it got to the Supreme Court, by a 6-3 ruling, they lifted those injunctions and said, we're going to reinstate Neer versus Minnesota against prior restraints on publication. The Times is represented by Floyd Abrams, who is generally recognized as the foremost First Amendment lawyer in the American history. His son, I think, Dan Abrams, is a newscaster today. But again, it's an example of a great synergy between lawyers and the press to make sure the public is properly informed. These are not all the cases illustrating the synergy between the First and the Sixth Amendment, but they are perhaps the most impactful. So why do I think this relationship is now under threat? People have always hated reporters and hated lawyers, so what's new? Well, what's new is billionaires, tech billionaires, buying up news organizations, not for journalistic purposes, but sort of as a public relations department for their core business, which has nothing to do with journalism. It's sort of, they're called vanity press barons. And I'm going to give you a few examples of those. Probably the most egregious is Jeff Bezos, who personally bought the New York Times, not through a corporation. But, I'm sorry, what did I say, New York Times?
Yeah.
Sorry, Freudian. The Washington Post. And you can see today, if you read the editorial sections and the comments, how he has moved it away over to an ideological point of view that's totally at odds with the way the Post had been regarded prior to that. Now, why would Bezos want the Washington Post? This guy's a tech billionaire. Amazon's his core business. Made plenty of money. Well, Amazon has a lot of regulatory problems, particularly antitrust problems. So Bezos not only contributes heavily to the president in his last campaign, but he needs the cooperation of the government to operate almost unlawfully his Amazon empire. So he buys the Washington Post and starts printing administration-friendly articles and editorials. And there have been firings at the Post, and a lot of the great journalists in the Post have quit because of this, because of the influence that Bezos is bringing on them to publish to a different point of view than they believe. And the selection of stories is different from what they would ordinarily call news. Then there's, on the West Coast, there's billionaire Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong, I think I pronounced his name properly, Soon-Shiong, who's a biotech mogul, billionaire, who bought the LA Times. And the reason he did was because he has regulatory problems with biotech, getting drugs approved, different medical devices approved, and he needs the cooperation of this administration. So he buys the LA Times to sort of be his stenographer and print things that would keep him in good favor with this administration. He even took credit for killing a story in the Times about Bobby Kennedy Jr. and some of the foolishness that he's trying to force on America with vaccines and other things. He took credit for killing that story. So you can see what his reach is within the LA Times organization. Then there's Salesforce billionaire, a big software company, who's owned by Mark Benioff. Benioff, another billionaire, has serious antitrust and regulatory problems with the DOJ. So he bought Time magazine and began running administration-friendly stories in Time magazine. And last but not least is the great Elon Musk, who bought Twitter. Now, Elon Musk has made more money off the federal government in subsidies to Tesla, contracts with SpaceX, and other contracts with every branch of the government, the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, NASA. He's made more money in subsidies and contracts off the government than anybody in history. And he needs to keep on the good side of his benefactor. So he buys Twitter, hooks it up to a bunch of bots, and now publishes things as if it were the Associated Press. And many people use Twitter, as we all know, for their source of news. Now, it's not just newspapers that billionaires are buying up for these purposes. CBS and 60 Minutes are now controlled by Larry Ellison. Oracle, another huge tech billionaire who bought CBS News through one of his corporations and put his son, David, in charge. And they are also heavily dependent on government contracts. Now, bear in mind, compared to the profit and the balance sheet of these companies, of Amazon and Oracle and the other companies that I mentioned, the news organization is a rounding error. They don't really, it doesn't matter to their bottom line very much whether the news organization is profitable or not. It's not, it's there for a different reason other than journalism. And so the Ellisons installed Barry Weiss, a young reporter, a young journalist, to be in charge of CBS News. And there was a great deal of rancor recently when she required 60 Minutes to spike a story about the CCOT facility, the prison facility in El Salvador, where all these migrants have been being sent, essentially a concentration camp. And she said the story wasn't ready for publication and spiked that story. I had a similar experience with CBS News back during the tobacco litigation. My client, Jeff Wygant, if any of you have seen the movie The Insider, CBS was in negotiations to be sold to, I think, Westinghouse by the Tisch family, who owned CBS. And they were worried that if CBS, if 60 Minutes, Mike Wallace, the correspondent, published the story about my client and what he had to say about nicotine manipulation in cigarettes, that he would be sued by the company would be sued by the tobacco industry and destroy the sale that he was trying to make with Westinghouse. So he actually made him water down the story, and Mike Wallace nearly quit over it. The journalist, Laurel Bergman, did quit over it. And then finally, when the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal published the story anyway, then they ran the full 60 Minutes episode, but it was after they had at first killed that story. So Barry Weiss is at 60 Minutes to make sure that nothing aired on 60 Minutes is going to be offensive to the administration. Ellison is a huge backer of the president, has been for years, and depends on the goodwill of the administration for Oracle and the other contracts his core business has. Now, none of these moguls that I've talked about have any journalistic experience. They don't really have any interest in accurate journalism. Their interest is to use the newspapers essentially as their stenographers or their public relations departments. These are the gatekeepers today of a great deal of our news. I didn't mention Rupert Murdoch. Because Fox News has always been a mouthpiece for the right wing and the administration. And I don't think they've ever made a pretense of being a serious news organization. So I left them out. But that's another major news outlet that is favorable to the administration and trying to control the news that we depend on to carry on our democracy. So how are law firms under threat? That's the media. One side, one pillar of this structure. How are law firms under threat? The administration has targeted 18 law firms that it doesn't like their clients, doesn't like the causes they represent. Some of them represented companies that were, represented clients that were involved in investigations of him or his family or his buddies. And so he has issued by executive order, he's banned them from federal billings, from any further government contracts, and he's taken their security clearances away. Now, these are 18 of the largest firms in the country, and a great deal of their business depends on having a security clearance so that they can defend cases that involve classified material. So all of a sudden, in one stroke of the pen, Mr. Trump has prevented any of these firms, these 18 firms, and I'm talking about firms like Paul Weiss and Kirkland & Ellis. I told you, remember Weymouth Kirkland? This is his old law firm, or his new law firm. This is the firm named after him. And so he settles with 9 of these firms. On terms that are not only unconstitutional but unethical. The thrust of the settlements are that they have to provide millions of dollars, in some cases over $100 million, in pro bono work for what's called for Trump administration priorities. That's a quote in their settlement agreements. Trump administration priorities. Now, it sounds fairly innocuous, pro bono work, free legal work. What could be wrong with that? Well, here's what's wrong with it. It gives the Trump administration a continuing veto on the clients and causes those law firms can represent. All he has to do, if they represent something or someone that he doesn't like, is say, that's not our priority, and so you have a conflict, you can't represent them. They're trying to circumvent the bar rule, Rule 5.6 of the ABA model rules that are enforced in, I think, every state, Dean. This says the lawyer can't, as part of a settlement agreement, agree to restrict his practice or agree to not to sue again the company he's settling with for one client. That's a serious bar offense. And by calling it pro bono work and making it nebulous like that, they're trying to circumvent that rule. Now, not all firms agreed to this settlement, but 9 of them did. Skadden Arps, I'm not going to list them all, but they're big firms that you've heard of. But there were 4 firms that took them on. Said, we're not going to knuckle under this, we're going to go to court. And they did. And all 4 of them, Sussman Godfrey, Wilmer Hale, I think there are two other firms that I was not familiar with that went to court. And in every case, the federal judges stood tall and found for the law firms for the reasons that I just articulated. Now, I'm no great fan of federal judges, but let that settle in. But they stood tall here and protected the rights of lawyers to represent clients of their choosing and not the choosing of the government. Now, I think for law, for lawyers, they're going to have to depend on the federal judiciary to protect their rights. And so far, as I said, the federal judges have stood tall. The press is another matter. I don't have good answers for what the press can do, the national press can do, given the fact that they're owned by these men I was talking about. One thing that I might offer for Dean Hickerson and the journal, Charlie, maybe you can think about this, is the model that Arizona State has adopted in the Cronkite School of Journalism out there. And what they've done is they've turned a campus newspaper to a statewide news syndicate, insulated from all of these pressures by the university. Now, that's not totally free of outside influence, but it's a lot more protected than ordinary journalism. And so what they've done out there is created a journalism school that's like the University Hospital in Jackson. It's a teaching, instead of a teaching hospital, it's a teaching newspaper. And they have students doing investigative reporting, not just learning about it. They share their information with local newspapers. They're like an Associated Press in that regard. They have a news spot, broadcast news spot on public broadcasting in their state, in Arizona. And essentially, they are the journalistic North Star in that state. And they're not getting too much pushback from the other newspapers, particularly where the papers are barely hanging on because they're providing stories for them. They're providing stories in news deserts, and they're going out and doing investigative work that some of the newspapers in Arizona and around the country now don't have the resources to do. They can't pay the reporters to go do things like that. So that's one thing to consider. Another might be setting up a joint committee, Dean Slayback, between the law school and the journalism school to come up with ways to counter the threats to the press and the law from the Trump administration. I wish I had an answer for how to do this. If I could still practice law, I'd try to come up with something. Shake it up a little bit, maybe. But anyway, that's my feeling. Tony told me I could, and David Cruz nicely told me I could talk about anything I wanted to. So there you have it. Hope it wasn't too strident for you. So thank you.
Please, questions.
Dick, let me ask you. I always want to get your understanding, so interrogate you. So much what you lined out about the tech barons overweening undue influence in, to use a country term, fiddling with journalism and the independence of the press. Seems so reminiscent of the the beginning of Teddy Roosevelt's taking on the trust, although I know it's totally different legal things, but I, as you know, come from a political background. Do you see some point in which history repeats itself, and follow where I'm going with that? we've got a different society today with tools at its disposal, for good or ill, that allow some end runs around traditional means of press, that it seems so hard that I agree with everything you say, as you know, but that we're not headed toward a tipping point by which both conspiracy theorists and those who ascribe to all of that, hearing what you just said, don't attribute to a grand scheme that I would buy into, that is afoot to try to manipulate news, coupled with the advent of social media and people's ability to express their opinions immediately, truth or not truth, fact-based or not fact-based, that is a force of nature that is out there that may not lead to some bubble in this, in which things pop in a way, maybe I'm being optimistic, things pop in such a way that some of the norms that we've known have to reset themselves, both because of the political dynamics, the tools that are in the hands of people today to deal with things and decipher news, or to filter and sift through things that they want to know and don't know, in such a way that seems like a dangerous combination for a long-term continuation of the Jeff Bezos ownership of the Washington Post, of all the other examples that you cited. It seems to me there's a gasoline and a match, and they just continue to get closer and closer to one another, all of which, when that explosion happens, metaphorically, that there's not a wake-up era, that there's not a truth verification time, because you can't control. I mean, it would be interesting to see any public polling on, and I don't know, Charlie, maybe you know, I think y'all rank higher than Congress on how people, barely, just a little bit. So I don't know that there's a huge confidence level to go, milestone to go grab, as much as maybe this conspiracy theorist idea that's out there turns around and bites the folks who are perpetuating it in the rear end. The second thing is this. One would think those who are doing the different things that have gone on related to the cases of the settlement with the law firms to not take on the administration. And I say this, as anybody in this room knows, as a die-hard, lifelong Democrat. That's a dangerous playbook to set in precedent. And by that I'm saying that if I were on the other side of this argument, if I were sitting in the Trump White House about this, knowing that the Constitution is going to hold and we're going to have a new president in 2028 of one ilk or the other, aren't you providing a dangerous roadmap? It may sound cute in the moment. It may look good for the minute. But just wake up in 2028 and Rahm Emanuel's president of the United States, and these court cases, which shall live on, are out there. I don't know that anybody cares. I'm going to be honest about that. I don't know that the immediacy of the moment doesn't, no pun intended, trump the long-term health of our democracy, but it's playing with fire.
That's a good point, Brandon. But remember that these tech bros that own these news outlets now are going to be there after Trump's gone. They're going to be able to, they're the gatekeepers now of what you're reading here. See on the news. Elon Musk can, with a flip of a switch, promote a story, kill a story.
Last question. Who would you say are the Dick Scruggs and Mike Moores? No, I mean this, seriously. Who from a public interest standpoint, as a constitutional officer, a legal officer, an attorney general, and someone looking at this grand complex problem that is actually getting to the merits of it in a way in which use the court as a route to bypass but actually get real effect against this type of cabal?
Well, one of the things that can, I don't know the name of any particular firm. The Sussman Godfrey firm is another firm that I think has the resources to take this on, and the legal brain power to come up with a legal theory on it. I think maybe ultimately with the new administration that antitrust laws can come into play and force divestiture of news organizations that are totally unrelated to the core businesses of their owners. I'm not quite sure what theory would work, but somebody's going to have to do that, and I'm sure they will. Lawyers love to fight, and somebody's going to find a way to do this, just like Mike and I found a way to go after big tobacco years ago. This is not right, and the law always holds that where there's a wrong, there's a remedy. And this is a huge wrong, and there's got to be a remedy. And I'm confident it will be.
Do you see any remedy for the brazen level of corruption and personal enrichment of the kind that just 10 years ago would have shocked all of us? But it's so normalized now that it's par for the course, with Jeff Bezos paying $41 million to Melania to make a bad movie about her, or Jared Kushner and Whitakoff taking in billions while they're doing the government's work, or Trump cryptocurrency, or billions from the government of Qatar. It's just unfathomable that this country can see this stuff and just look the other way, and that all the checks and balances that are written in the Constitution are not exercised, and you've got spineless moral midget cowards in Congress who don't recognize an impeachable offense when all of these are, and without a Justice Department that's free of political influence to go after this stuff. Do we have any remedy? We've got Caligula on the throne, and nobody wants to do anything about it.
Jerry Jordan's heard me complain about this in our Tuesday, what I call our woke old guys group. Every Tuesday we meet at the Methodist Church, not religious, just talk about politics, about 30, 35 guys. Jerry's heard me talk about this. The troubling thing is that the Founding Fathers did everything they could foresee to prevent what's happening today from happening. And yet, the country elected Donald Trump, knowing who and what he was. That's the scary thing that troubles me. Is there a flaw in our American democratic system that will allow a man like that to be elected, whether he's lying or whatever? And consider that election, even though it was very narrow and popular vote, a mandate to do create the misery he's creating now. I'm hopeful that a new administration, an honest Justice Department, will move against some of these people later, and not just say, well, we're going to move on to something else, and this will just be an aberration in American history, and we're going to put it in the rearview mirror and move on to the business as usual before Trump. I'm hoping that there are legal measures taken against some of the main culprits in this panjandrum.
My international friends don't blame Donald Trump. They blame evangelicals.
Yeah, well, that I think that's fair.
One of the things that's going on with the ACLU and on 18th Strauss, and you're probably familiar with that, is other than they are taking a legal approach to the fact that social media platforms curate their content, and the theory is that that's too much power to put in the hands of one thing, you know, and the FCC requires diversity, you know, newspapers couldn't own radio stations, and so the policy going back 100 years and coming forward has been for the government to promote a conversation. The basics of the Times versus Sullivan was free, robust, open exchange of ideas. And to the extent that social media has the power to limit that now by curating their sites, it's scary to the ACLU and a lot of other people. But the other part of that is that they're businesses, and if you take away their ability to decide what type of content they're going to have, then you destroy their business model. You know, if you can put whatever you want to on you know, whether it's nudity or obscenity or whatever, if social media spaces have become equated to First Amendment spaces, then you've destroyed the business model for those companies. But anyway, there is a legal approach being taken. I think there's a case, one came out of the Fifth Circuit, and which the Fifth Circuit said that to have a corporation to decide, you know, content was totally wrong, and another circuit looked at the same thing and said, you know, this is their property, they can decide what people post on there. And I think that's on cert. I don't know whether it's gone or not.
Well, normally if circuits differ in their rulings, that's grounds for the Supreme Court to take it out. Yeah. So I don't know how that's going to come out, but I don't trust our Supreme Court right now.
Dickie, to me, there's not a single problem we have in this country that an educated electorate would not solve. And as our lifelong educators, journalists need to be much more involved in education rather than what happened today, or in addition to what happened today. And this is the premise the Jordan Center is founded on. There's always a kind of a fine line between advocacy and activism, and the academics in the Jordan Center tend to lean towards advocacy, and I'm always kind of pushing them towards advocacy as activism. So that's an interesting situation. We'll see how it plays out. But one thing we're doing in the Jordan Center is forming a student media lab. And the idea is kind of modeled along this Arizona State model that you and I discussed. I want to know more about that model, and maybe you can tell me, but are the students doing opinion pieces?
I think so.
And are those opinion pieces political? And, well, comment.
I don't know the answer to that.
I can answer that for you, too.
Okay.
Yeah, they do have a commentary in a public opinion section, and it's a lab, and they're run by professional editors, similar, like it's a bureau, but they are still a student media product, although they're statewide. So how they came up with the model, that they do all the things and disseminate it to people. So you can take their opinions or don't take their opinions, but the students are providing a full range of publications and products for radio and all of these things. So I do the site visit at ASU for their accreditation.
So you think the answer is yes?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, we have a precedent here. I think Glenn Voice does a great job as chancellor, but Glenn does not seem to be averse to taking up political causes, and maybe he would not be able to object so strongly if we have a student media plan that takes up some political causes.
Well, this would also lend itself to a good committee. I keep asking Dean Slayback to create a speakers bureau and all these things that at the law school, but I think a committee between law and journalism to explore these problems and come up with solutions that maybe would warrant a law journal article that some law firm would read and decide that they could take it on. And the courts are the only thing keeping us free right now, and it's scary given some of the judges we have to deal with.
So Dick, I have a question. Actually, it's a comment to corroborate, and it's just sort of terrifying to think about. You know, for the last couple hundred years, editors are put in newspapers to go after these great stories that need to be told, and they are typically like-minded. But it's generally been understood in that business that the greatest newspapers and the ones that do the best to change what the status quo depend on a really great publisher who is willing to dedicate those resources to things like covering civil rights and deploying journalists and reporters to those areas. And if a great newspaper is dependent on a publisher who is willing to dedicate those resources and not bow into the pressures brought on by advertisers and things like that, what you're talking about and what's happening is just absolutely terrifying.
Sure is. Anyway, I hope I'll stimulate some ideas here.
One of the problems is public universities are controlled by people who give a certain amount of money for someone becoming governor or spend a certain amount of money to get elected. They're not necessarily educators. And so private universities now have an advantage that public universities don't in terms of the political arena.
Well, the point is that it's Arizona State's Cronkite School, for example, that I've mentioned and that you so eloquently described, is not totally insulated from political pressure anymore, but at least they enjoy the political independence that any other university department enjoys. They're part of the university. And the university, if any institution is insulated from political whim, I think it's the university system, because they're Board of Regents, or in our case, the IHL, and the reason for those institutions is to prevent.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. They have a chancellor or president who's been there a long time. And he's got a great reputation, but he's about to be changed. And so we'll see whether it lasts beyond him. He's been able to pull off stuff most people weren't able to pull off because of his status. And to pick the next one will be very political.
Well, you can't take politics, we can't take politics out of it. I mean, there's nothing in life that I think is totally free from politics. But you want to insulate it as best you can. And apparently they feel like they are out there, because they're going great guns.
I was going to say, I think that's part of the challenge, is that it's a real chilling effect. More than 600 academics have lost their jobs for First Amendment academic freedom.
All over the country?
Yeah, incidents. And to have that many people out of systems all over the country, people are now quiet. Academics are having the conversations. In fact, Dean Slaybaugh, 2 of his faculty members are going to come speak to the National Association of Black Journalists Academic Task Force to help people navigate what is academic freedom and what First Amendment rights they still have if they're practicing journalists and having to be academics as well. And so we're having that conversation on April the 13th because people are quiet, more quiet than they've ever been, people who have never been quiet because the current political culture is saying that you, tenure or no tenure, you're out, and it's happening. So there's a whole group that is concerned about. So to Will's statement is that the landscape has changed, and even places that have stood up strong programs like ASU are trembling. And I would love to have some conversations about how to support people and what we can do and how we can help people have more media literacy to understand that it's not just the outlets that are struggling. The people who produce the content, who are now academics and professionals, are feeling, insecure and frightened.
There's a great story in the New Yorker about the lack of independence in the future of universities.
Well, next year, probably, someone will come in here and talk about the threats to the universities around the country, and that's a valid concern. I think it is. I hadn't thought about it in those terms. I was thinking. Well,
He's got class.
Yeah, we have people who are both.
Good.
Academics and journalists.
Well, I was going to suggest my no good brother-in-law, Trent Lott, was going to be here today, and he's got some allergy issue. Showed up for a minute and then took off. But I was going to suggest we send him to Washington to get it all straightened out.
Are there other questions, comments? Just, Dick, if I might, in terms of Sullivan, there now are 2 Supreme Court justices, Thomas and Gorsuch, who argued that it should be overturned. In a case out of Florida a couple of years ago, Gorsuch issued a blistering dissent because the court upheld Sullivan. The dissent was very detailed and to some extent along the lines of some of the comments that Brandon made earlier, that the reason Times needs to be overturned is because the landscape has changed. There are no gatekeepers. Social media has the ability to destroy one's reputation with absolutely no recourse unless Times is overturned. And my honest opinion, I thought Gorsuch made a pretty compelling argument, as much as I disagree with it, but I think it's an argument that will probably fly more and more with the public, and I fear for the Times doctrine long term.
Yeah.
Do you think the Mississippi Today case is going to wind up being the one?
I hope not, but I think that could be. This is the one, but Phil Bryant sued Mississippi Today. You guys are all familiar with it. Anyway, he's going to take it to the Supreme Court, and they might reverse or modify Sullivan, and that's a real risk. And I think there are a lot of cases like that around the country that are actually settling to prevent the Supreme Court from getting a shot at it. Even though settlements are distasteful, like Trump's suit against ABC, against George Stephanopoulos for saying that he committed rape when in fact it was sexual assault and not technically rape. And so that was another slap suit. But ABC, rather than take a risk on Sullivan and actual malice, losing that, went ahead and settled. And a humiliating, poor George Stephanopoulos had to make that humiliating apology on TV.
Just want to say we've had a free lunch today, and we appreciate it. And appreciate what you've had to say, Dickie. And we're having a symposium sponsored by the Jordan Center with Dickie's assistance as well. April 17th. All of you are invited. We're going to provide free lunch with Adam Kinzinger as the keynote speaker, and we also have Joe Kennedy III speaking, and we've got Brian Stelter coming, Ellen McCarthy, several other prominent luminaries. And we'd love to have all of you come.
Is Shad White going to let you do it?
Well, I wanted Shad to come because I'd like to put him on the spot a little bit, but academics prevailed on that one.
Everybody, thank you for coming. Please join me in thanking Dick.